recording.
Thank you. Right, cheers, guys. Firstly, massive thank you for giving us some time to do this. If you could just give me a quick intro, a little bit about your coaching history, a little bit about your sporting interests, that would be great. We'll start with you, Chris.
Cool. Yeah, Chris Peden. I'm a former physical trainer in the Royal Navy. Got a master's degree in sports, in strength and conditioning and sports rehabilitation. Been a trainer now 20 odd years. Work with a mix of riders between juniors through to masters and a good chunk of people in the men's and women's world tour as well.
No, thank you, Kieran.
So I am S&C coach. Worked in a variety of different sports, endurance sports most recently over the last kind of 5 years or so. Got a master's degree in human applied physiology. Do a lot of work currently in sort of cycling and like running mostly. I've done a whole load of different sports, bit of everything over the years, but yeah, kind of mostly endurance focused in the last kind of few years. And yeah, kind of the topic of this is kind of where I've focused on most in terms of strength training for endurance athletes of all manners.
A nice one. Well, that sort of leads us nicely onto the first question. So, you know, I still find a lot of pushback from endurance athletes with regards to strength training on multiple levels. If you just give me an overview, why do you know, if you had an athlete asking you why they should strength train, what would you say to them? Why should they include strength training in their programming? Go.
Oh God, why shouldn't they? Yeah, I mean, if we think of what strength is, like even as an athlete, so and then cyclists won't particularly think of themselves like this, that every pedal revolution and every time they press down on the pedals is an expression of force. You know, and strength essentially by nature is your expression of force within a given movement and or time constraint. So the better we can get you at producing force, or the more force we can produce, or the quicker we can get you producing force, you're going to go faster, you're going to not fatigue as quick. And then from performance aside, you know, just making the body a little bit more resilient. We're raising the capacity of the body to handle more training load. We're raising the tissue capacity to be able to express more force and handle more force. So you don't break down as much, and you can, like I say, yeah, like that, you can just handle a bit higher levels of training load with less fatigue. So
yeah. Kieran, anything to add, mate?
I think you're starting with why not is a good point, as Chris sort of said. Is that there's very few downsides that I can see, and kind of a lot of the reservations are kind of based in just misunderstanding, I guess, of what strength training is, but also what it does for you as an athlete. So having an idea of it just being as everything we do is an expression of force and producing that force. And as you said, Chris, like then when you're looking at cycling, running, whatever that endurance sport might be, all we're doing is we're just expressing force on a kind of a smaller scale, effectively, every pedal stroke, every step and running. And so then if you look at something like economy of movement and being efficient in your movement, which is what all endurance training in any sport is all about, you're creating more economy, more efficiency in how you move if you have a higher strength capacity. So you kind of view it as performance, i.e. stuff that's directly benefiting your ability to perform in your endurance sport, and then resilience, injury prevention, just generally being a functional human being outside of like being an athlete in whatever your sport is. It's got wide ranging benefits that are both direct and indirect within your sports performance context.
Yeah, very much so. And from a starting point with endurance athletes, where do you like to start your athletes in terms of movement competency? You know, looking at strength training as a skill. Where do you tend to start them? Chris, shoot.
Yeah, cool. Excuse me. So suppose I base everything around the six functional movement patterns. From a basic start point from anyone, like that I'll see is how well can they do them from a body weight perspective. That's not necessarily always the true indicator of how well they move. A body weight squat is a great example. Someone can completely butcher an air squat, give them a goblet squat, and it cleans things up instantly. So, but a basic movement competency assessment would just give us an idea of what do we feel comfortable programming them, and how confident do we feel in what loading parameter will give. So if we use a squat as an example again, if I can see you body weight squat, fine. I might, even if I've not don't depend on your training history and what you're telling me, what you've been exposed to previously, I probably will start you there with a goblet squat and just see how your squat pattern is, and just reinforce the skill of squatting before I ever think about putting a bar across your shoulders. So whilst if we want to use you to squat as an example, what's the most appropriate way for you to squat? And it's not, and you don't have to just back squat. So are they efficient with the skill of movement? Because strength is a skill. Have they got the adequate mobility and stability around certain things that you're assessing on 2 legs and 1 leg, etc. And then that, like I say, that just gives me an idea to make me confident going, cool, like what exercise can I give you? So if listeners aren't aware of what movement patterns are in relation to exercises, think of it as your training zones, zone 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and you get prescribed specific sessions within that match those zones. Movement patterns are exactly the same. So we have a squat pattern, a hinge pattern, a single leg pattern, push, pull, core. But then there's an array of exercises that can fit into those, and there's you hold your voice when it comes to that, and that just then hopefully allows endurance athletes to understand what we mean by an overarching label of a movement pattern. And as long as you're not missing any of those, you're not going to miss out on anything effectively. So that's from like an exercise selection standpoint. And then do you want like loading and sort of like sets and reps and how I would potentially, or
we'll get onto that. I'll share it over to Kieran, but I certainly want to come. I want to come back to that, because a lot of the questions that have come in on the joys of Instagram have been about reps, sets, loads. So we'll certainly dial in on that. Kieran, anything to add, mate?
I think anyone, and this is probably a wider misconception within strength and conditioning as a kind of a thing, is that everybody's a person first and athlete second. So how you address strength training for anyone is largely quite similar, in terms of, as Chris was sort of talking about there, like movement patterns don't change largely between people. Yes, there's going to be levels of skill that people do or do not have within certain movement patterns, but in a general sense, everybody moves in a very similar way, or should be moving in a very similar way. And how we train them doesn't necessarily differ that much. So yeah, it's the basic movement patterns. You said squatting, hinging, pushing, pulling. So starting with that, just making sure is someone able to move in those patterns in a competent way. And yeah, say like it makes most sense in most cases to start with body weight, just because that's in most instances the simplest starting point. You say then adding load to people once they are competent in those patterns. So it's always a case of just looking at where someone's at, where someone may be deficient in terms of either movement quality, so the skill of movement, or in expression of force, and then taking them to where you want them to end up. And that's obviously a wider discussion around, say, some of the other points to discuss of what's strong enough. But
yes,
the idea of you start at a point and you take someone through a process to get them to another point in terms of improving at a skill. And really all we're looking for in a sense of getting someone better for their endurance sport is the transfer of that to their sport. But starting from a standpoint of taking it general to specific, which is how you approach any form of training, is starting general and going more specific as you get closer to whatever the end goal might be. But it's taking someone from can you produce the movements we want you to produce in a kind of fairly controlled setting. Then it's like, cool, can we now stress that with some load, speed, whatever that might be, the parameters you're talking about. and then taking someone to the end point of like, cool, now we've hit these markers of something we want, whatever the arbitrary number is, or load, or whatever. You're like, cool, now we've achieved this. Now we can maybe add complexity, add load, whatever that might be in that respect. So it's always starting from general, going to specific as you go through that process. And so it looks different for everybody, but the overarching themes are very much the same. It's always the same or very similar movement patterns. Exercise selection might change depending on the individual, and training history. But I think, yeah, it may be a gross generalization, but most endurance athletes have not got a huge training history in strength training. So typically it looks very basic at the start. And then it gets more kind of complex as you get into that. But I think, yeah, people maybe look to it and see some of the kind of complexities and higher level strength training that athletes in different sports will be doing, and then kind of say, I don't need that. I need, because I'm a cyclist. And it's like, well, you're probably true, because you have a training age of 0 and they have a training age of 15, 20 years. So that's where I think some of the pushback comes from. Is in terms of, right, beginner. You might have been a runner for 25 years, but you might have never stepped foot in a gym. So it's like, yeah, you've got a training age of 25 years and you're running, but you've got 0 training age in terms of like anything in strength training. So yeah, as you say, it largely starts with body weight and moves up from there.
Yeah, and on that, let's talk weight reps sets, which is the question that a huge amount of people have wanted to know. Where do they start? What rep range are they looking at? What load should they be looking at, and how do they integrate that into their season?
It's the magic question, isn't it? Everybody wants to know how. I think the reps and sets is an interesting one, isn't it? Because that, I think it's dictated by quite a lot of different factors, like training age being one of them. Like, you're not going to give someone who's never stepped foot in a gym before a 1 rep max necessarily to do, because it's just not an appropriate rep range necessarily an associated load. But like, you kind of got some general things you look at, I suppose, in terms of maybe where strength training goes wrong in endurance sport is that they treat it the same as the sport. They're like, oh, my sport is endurance focused, so my strength training should be endurance focused. And they do massive sets of kind of circuit type stuff, or very, very light load work. And then it's like, well, that's not really strength training necessarily. You're not expressing force in a way that's actually truly stressing your body, that's going to generate and develop strength.
Yeah, and it surprises me that misconception still permeates throughout cycling. Right, there is still this belief, and I saw you did a post about it the other day, Chris. There's still this belief that 20, 25, 30 rep range with a light load is the answer to endurance sport.
Yeah.
But even to the top down, even in the World Tour, it's been prescribed from cycling coaches to their athletes. So it's all a nice and a problematic part of cycling is its history and its culture. Like, in one aspect, it's beautiful and amazing, and that's why we all love cycling. But also, it's the thing that holds us back when performance is trying to be nudged a little bit further forward. And every aspect has had it. When people were telling the whole aerodynamic thing and how things have now changed in terms of fabrics on clothing, and how positions can change on bikes to make you more aero. Again, that created huge resistance initially, but now that it's just a given,
Yeah.
And all sports have had resistance against, S&C, but it's like the cultural thing of it only gets done at a certain time, or it gets done in a certain way. Again, it's just old belief systems and old history and culture just being pulled through.
And you're finding that's still the case in the higher level of the sport. There's still
Yeah. It's even
just despite the evidence pointing to the contrary, it's still that history is and sort of tradition within cycling is pushing back strongly.
Yeah, I think it's just so you've still got people that just outright don't like it and don't think it works and will not give it to any athletes. And then you've got other coaches that are willing to and are willing to put faith in coaches to look after their athletes. And then, like you say, you still get prescription and seeing like, well, this is what I was given from my cycling coach. This is like XYZ. And then it's like, like, and like I've always stood, and I've always stood by this. Like, if someone's telling me it doesn't work, it's because the programming was wrong.
Yeah.
What you were given doesn't work for the demands of what you were trying to give, or you're too sore and fatigued. Let's have a look at what you were doing. And it's always like, look, no wonder. Like, I've been in the gym for the last, good, yeah, like I said, I started when I was 15, so a good while. And I wouldn't want to swing my leg over a top tube, having a look at some of these sessions, like, because it's just a typical like bodybuilder style.
Bodybuilder, yeah.
Leg day, So
huge volume.
yeah, so I think, and I guess, ultimately, it's a belief system. If I was sat here as a, born and raised as a Catholic, and I told all you guys not being a Catholic is stupid, and that you don't believe in, because you don't believe in God or whatever else it may be, you'd be like, you just put your fingers up at me and tell me to piss off. Like, and that's what you kind of, sometimes with in cycling or anything, dietary beliefs, it's like, if someone's got a hard back belief system around a certain protocol or a certain way of doing things, when you challenge that, it challenges something internally within them, so that instantly get the back up. And I learned that hard way in terms of, like, I used to really shoot from the hip and be like, you're all not knobheads, but I was going to say that, but like, you're all idiots for like not doing this, and why are you doing it that way, blah blah blah, because like, I'm in the know and you should be doing, like, I'm like thinking I'm like this oracle of knowledge, and just people just don't want to know. So I had to like really shift how I spoke about things in the last 3 years or so, 4 years. And even then I still got like, I'm human as well, so if something did trigger me, eventually I did have a bit of a rant every now and then. You can't be stoic all the time, so, but I learned to like, no, like, let's come across with it in a more educational way, to say like, I get why you understand that, but these are the reasons why, or this is how you can potentially approach it, or help me understand why you think that can't work, or what is it that's happening, why it's not, and let's explain in a different way how you could overcome it, and actually how you can implement it better, and how you can implement it like, more consistently, as a consequence of just being a little bit smarter with that approach. And then you get a little bit more buy-in, because you're actually educating them rather than just saying you're an idiot for doing it a certain way, and that's ultimately, when, although we're correct in what we're saying, like, you got to be smart. I think, you just got to be careful.
I think some of the resistance from it comes from like either 2 points, either people, I mean road cycling especially is like, it dies on its traditions, and that's like kind of, it's really hard to change the opinions of people, because they've either been told by someone, don't need that, that's rubbish, don't do that, do this, or it's a case of you say like, people are like, it didn't work for me when I did this, so it's rubbish and doesn't work. And I'm like, well, and I think that when people ask what, and then that's why people ask, what's the reps and sets? And that's a really common question. They want a very prescriptive, do this, do this, do this. Which I think is hard, because then, I mean, from my point as a coach, I'm sure most coaches, the answer is always, it depends. And that's really unhelpful as an answer, because it doesn't give people any actual takeaway of like, okay, I need to go away and do 5 sets of this with this weight. But the problem is, it kind of does depend on a lot of factors. Training aid, there's so much in there that it kind of depends on, in terms of like what you're trying to achieve, what you're trying to achieve at certain times in the season, what your other training looks like. And I think the problem is, and people kind of look at that and they're like, well, my coach told me to do 10 sets of 10 because that like is what we do in our sport, and it's strength endurance, and that makes most sense. And it's like, well, that doesn't really make sense when you consider everything else in your training. And so I think what happens is, then people just stick to kind of like the classics of like 3 sets of 10 bodybuilding style training, classic training splits, sort of like chest and arms and legs and all that kind of stuff. And it's like, well, that might not be most appropriate for you as an athlete, you where you're at currently, but also in consideration of the fact that you also do 25 hours a week of other sport, like actual cycling or running or whatever other training that is. So I think it comes from...
Keep talking, I'm just going to shut my son up.
Harrison, upstairs with it.
Training of like, you kind of take one side of it where it's like strength training and endurance training, and rather than being like, cool, how can we make these work together, it's like, well, we're just going to have a strength training program and a cycling program, we're just going to kind of like mash them together, and like, it doesn't work. And I'm like, well, of course it was never going to work. Like, you're doing 2 separate programs, mashing them together badly, and the strength program was probably never appropriate anyway. So I think it's really hard to give a kind of like do 5 sets of 10 reps at this weight, because it's just there's so many factors that go into that, and it's tough because obviously in endurance sport you might be working with a team of cyclists. You might have whatever, like World Pro Tour team that you're working with, however many cyclists in that team, and you kind of have to be efficient to be able to work with all of them in one go, but also understand the fact that one of them might have been training for 5 years in the gym, one might never have stepped foot in the gym, one might be really like skilled in the movement side of things, one might have zero ability in the gym. So it's kind of like giving people a do this way is really hard. I think to the point of like people going down the route of like basically doing endurance or strength endurance or circuits, I'm like, that probably doesn't work for most people. Maybe if you're a complete beginner, that might work. But then in terms of actually giving people an idea of like percentages and reps and sets and that kind of stuff, like anything below around sort of like 60 to 70% of a max output in terms of force, it's largely not doing anything. And I think the nice way you can look at cycling training, for example, like most people's zone 2 sits around 60 to 70% of like a VO2 max or an FTP or whatever you want to sort of use as a figure, like around 60 to 70%. Anything below that, and you kind of just see that as like base volume. It's the same as true in strength training. Anything kind of below 60 to 70% of max is kind of not really stimulating enough to do anything. So when you see someone doing these 25 set like rep sets with body weight or whatever, like 5 kilo weight or something like that, I'm like, you're sitting in that like really low base volume kind of space. So I think when people look at strength training, I'm like, from a standpoint of getting the most benefit for the least amount of time put in, which is what all endurance athletes want, because no endurance athlete wants to be spending 7-8 hours a week in the gym. They want to kind of have 2 sessions, 30-40 minutes and be done. It's like, for the most bang for buck, I'm like, do the stuff you don't get from your endurance sport, your cycling, your running, lift heavy weights.
Yeah.
Generally 60-70% or above is probably where you're aiming for.
So if we've established this huge benefit to increasing that strength ceiling. Now, you alluded to it earlier. How strong is strong enough? You know, when is there diminishing returns for getting stronger, and we need to start looking at, you know, rate of force production and how quickly we can express that force. So how strong do you want a cyclist and athlete to be?
Quantifiably, we don't know.
Yeah,
because there's no data on it. That being said, you know, there would be some nice parameters around a body weight squat, 1.5 times body weight squat, or 1.5 times trap bar as an example. So what's your relative weight, relative strength? So like endurance athletes know what's per kg is. Your relative strength is the same in the gym. Yeah. So what can you lift in relation to your body weight in kilograms? So there's no set weight, like as in like I need to be able to lift 100 kgs. Yeah, like some of us meatheads back in the day, like, yeah, we're in the 100 kg club, like brilliant, like that was a tick in the box.
Still got the t-shirt.
But it's not like there's like, think of it in relation to your body weight. And again, you've got to start where you are. Like just by doing something to begin with, you're going to get stronger. And then how do we safely get you there? Now, strength is a skill that you don't want to lose. So that might mean that it might take you a couple of seasons to get to where your strength standards are. And actually then once you're there, going beyond that, like the juice isn't worth the squeeze, because really, whilst in some sports, a 2 times body weight squat is, and above that is a gold standard from force production and injury management as an endurance athlete, like the time invested to get to a 2 times body weight squat or deadlift, whatever else it may be, just isn't worth it. So actually, once we start getting that 1 to 1.5, we're probably in a good place. But how do we do that? And in what exercise is that most appropriate for you as the athlete, in what you're most skilled at? So one athlete might be that they can do it with a barbell back squat, and another athlete, I'm not putting you under a bar whatsoever because you may be too tall or you just mobility isn't there. So I will have you do that with a trap bar. Please know if you do it on a leg press, it's going to be way easier. So you're probably going into 2 or 3 times body weight as a consequence, because The leg press provides a lot of external stability, so you just need to sit in and produce a lot of force and not have to worry about your body stabilizing yourself. So it's a lot easier to rack up the numbers, and it feeds your ego, but it's not this. Don't think then it's a natural correlation to what you should be able to squat. But yeah, like I say, that has to be done in a very safe manner, and that's going to be individualized to the athlete in front of us and their level of skill and what they're capable of doing. And for, like Kieran alluded to earlier, like, you know, I've started working with a world tour athlete, but they've got zero training age from a gym perspective. So I have to start really simple and basic, and get them used to goblet squatting and exhausting how much they can goblet squat before they even go anywhere near more advanced things. And if you understand, get very good and great at doing the simple and basic things.
Yeah.
Because once that skill is reinforced, you're going to get stronger anyway. Your ability to produce force is going to be enhanced because you're better at the skill. And then, so we have to, like, that has to be, you have to take that into account. It's not just as simple as let's chase a certain number or a certain thing. If you're in that now, if you're going into your off season now and you've been through a period of, you know, skill development, and you've had a nice bit of history and training age, and you might be like, do you know what, actually, like, now I've got no racing to worry about and no fatigue to worry about. Chasing a 1.5 times bodyweight squat during the off season would be a nice goal to have for some of you, but for some of you, it's completely pointless. Like, because we're still in a skill phase of trying to get you where we want to be. And again, you don't want to hear, well, I don't want to work with you for 2 years just to get to that point. But no, that's, you know, for some of you, yeah, that might be needed. And it's, you know, we want to chase the adaptation, not necessarily an exercise or a certain load outcome. And we know we need to get you stronger. How do we get you stronger? You need to start you off safely from, you know, general preparation, just to get the joints, ligaments, soft tissues all loaded. I generally don't start anyone above 10 reps because I don't think you need to for any general prep stuff. Then I'm going to lower you down, and I'm going to surf that way between 3 and 6 reps for as long as I need to, in different loading parameters and whatever else, depending on where you're at within the season, to, you know. And then when I get windows of opportunity, it's like, cool, well, now we can block focus into that because we've got time. If you're someone that's always racing and always trying to race because you're doing an indoor season and an outdoor season, you're not going to give yourself times for actual direct prep that might enhance you to your next block. But I've got athletes now that have been with me 5-6 years, and every season something shows up. Every season, like, there's never anything that's just going to exactly be like, I'm done and dusted. It's like something else will show in their performance just through years of layering in consistent strength training. It's not an easy answer, like I say, like, and like I spoke about the other week, like, it's unfortunately not quantifiable, which makes it harder to get buy-in from riders, because ultimately you care about performance and you care about numbers. So, like, you care that you want your FTP to be higher, or your spin power to be higher, whatever it may be. We can't turn around and say, well, if we get you 1.5 times body weight, we're going to put 30 watts on your FTP.
Yeah.
Like, that's just impossible for us to say. So, like, it's an undefined answer.
Returns a bit, isn't it? It's like how much, I think you approach it as like, what's the minimum you can do to get the most return?
Yeah.
And I think diminishing returns in that respect, in terms of like, okay, we can keep layering on more and more and more, but at a certain point, something else has to give. And I think that's sometimes where you kind of look at it. It's like, okay, cool, we could get you stronger, but that's probably going to start impacting on your ability on the bike, or whatever that is in terms of your training or competitive, like, racing season. So you kind of look at it as like, okay, well, we could get you stronger, but is it necessary? Do we need to? And so there's no quantifiable numbers there. They just don't exist. We don't know. It's going to be different for every individual anyway. But because there are plenty of people who compete at a world-class level and are best in the world, who you look at their strength training and it's kind of like mediocre or non-existent in comparison to anyone else. And I'm like, well, they might just be good because they're good, and it might be nothing to do with that side of it. But yeah, there's always going to be a point where it's like we could do more, but to achieve that greater volume of strength training, which is going to have the impact of increasing your squat numbers or whatever that might be, we have to make sacrifices elsewhere. And then that's going to be an individual thing of like what's the level that you're willing to sacrifice to get stronger, if that might not actually then be directly correlating to improved performance on the bike or running or whatever that might be.
Right. You mentioned top level cyclists. Now, I'm sure we've all seen the social media footage of Tadej and Bernal with multiple minibands around their every limb flapping away before a race. Give me your thoughts on pre-activation or whatever you want to call it.
I think
it's interesting one. Pre-activation.
Without swearing, please, Chris.
you're going to be doing say this arbitrary, whatever, like a stage of the Tour de France. It's going to be 7 to 8 hours long. The thing you did for 10 minutes with a load of bands at the start maybe has a benefit for like the first 10 minutes of that, and then beyond that, it's kind of like, well, that's there's no real benefit to that. That was pointless. I think it's a weird one. People put big. I think it's as much a mental thing as it is a physical thing. As in, you get probably as much from it mentally in terms of prepping yourself and putting yourself into the mindset of then going into it as you do physically. Physically, I think unless you're like grandma sitting on the couch and you've never done anything physical in your life, you're getting very little from it in reality. It's like foam rolling. It's kind of like everybody at one point was like, this is amazing, this is great, but in reality it probably doesn't have the benefits people think, or the long lasting benefits people think, at least. And I think all of the kind of pre-activation stuff, there is definitely a place for it in the right context and in the right sort of like frame of reference of why someone might be doing that. But I think it's one of those things that kind of people look at that and they care more about that than what they actually do in the actual session they might be doing, or what they're going into. And I'm like, well, then that's when it's like that point of diminishing returns. Like, you spend 40 minutes warming up. I'm like, that doesn't mean your session is going to be X amount better. It just means you kind of wasted a lot of time doing something that may or may not have kind of had any real benefit to it. So yeah, I don't know. I think it's a contentious subject, definitely within S&C circles.
it's
Anything to add?
Yeah, I think it's like, first and foremost, like it's doing no harm, like, and it's doing no harm to the athletes or anyone that chooses to do it. That it's just the messaging around it isn't factually correct in terms of why it's being used. So it gets proposed that there's, by doing this band work or activation work, whatever you want to call it, is that there's a cause and effect. If I do these abduction work and activate my glute med or activate my glutes, that by that there's an effect of that I will produce more power, or I will perform better in my race or event, whatever else it may be. And that's not generally how it works. So like the neuromuscular system in itself is very good at knowing what muscles to activate. Your brain will tell you what it needs to do. Now, I will caveat in terms of like, if someone needs it in terms of because it helps them be ride pain-free, because we've got a certain pathology of injury that needs to be dealt with, and it's beneficial from a pre-ride thing, from an injury management perspective, I'm all for it. And so I will, and I have given it to athletes in certain contexts around injury management, but not for performance. So if you look at a band, you do a band work, it'll probably incur, I don't know, 20-30% voluntary contraction rate between, into that muscle. When you go and pedal, especially when you pedal with a lot of force, like if you do a sprint, or if you do some overgeared work, if you get onto a climb, your voluntary contraction rate of your legs are probably like 60, 70, 80%, like especially for your sprint, you need maximum voluntary contraction. So we're like 50% away from what the band is stimulating to what your muscles are capable from a maximal force output. So you mean, like Kieran alluded to, like if you're then doing that and then you've got a long road race and you've got a huge neutralized zone and then you're cruising along for X amount of Ks before you even choose to attack, probably not going to, it's doing you no performance benefit.
Yeah.
Now the lads like if you look at the World Tour as an example, when it's in the States, the Tour de France, and you see the ones that are going from the gun and are trying to get into that break of the day right from the off, they'll be on the turbo beforehand doing a pre-ramped warm-up because they know they're going to go full gas right from the off. So just like time trialists would do, you've got a ramped protocol of going from easy to some harder efforts to some sprint efforts to really, should I word, fully maximally activate and recruit these muscles to produce a set amount of force.
Yeah.
The brain knows what to do. So the moment you ride your bike, the brain goes, oh, we're riding at 100 watts. Recruit this amount of muscle fibers, produce this amount of force. There you go. The moment you say, I need to do a sprint or ride at threshold or whatever it may be, your brain also goes, hey, we need to recruit more muscle fibers here, and we need to recruit them a lot faster, and we need to produce more force. Unless you are clinically injured, that's never not happening. Like that's, so, and the band doesn't change that, unfortunately. But like I say,
that pre-activation only really has benefit if you're touching or getting anywhere close to a near max voluntary contraction. You said like the actual physiological side of it, and like you doing your band work has 0 to no impact on anything beyond like the couple of minutes after that. And even then, it's really just making you warmer. It's not really doing much. It's blood flow. That's the only real thing it's probably benefiting, if anything.
Even then, I'd say it doesn't have any benefit to it at all. You'd be better off just doing your normal ramp. Now, if you, like I say, if you're using it from an injury perspective, because it's helping something and it's just offsetting a joint or whatever, I've got no issues with that. When it's used in the context of performance, it's not doing what it's proposed to say on the tin.
Especially at that level, and some of those guys can put out, I don't know, what, 1800 watts or more at a max level. And then like you're playing around with band that probably provides you like a few kilos, if that, of resistance. I'm like, it's just like, it's beyond the point of like, I'm like, I don't know, you jumping on your bike or you just walking around like the warm-up area would do more in terms of like activating muscles than the band's going to do.
If you're a healthy adult with no injuries, no previous pathologies, your neuromuscular system works pretty efficiently and knows what to do. The stimulus is too low to have a cause and effect of performance. So you'd just be better off doing a general warm-up, a couple of sprints, and like you're ready to go. Really, you're better.
I don't think any hunter-gatherers were doing like all their band work before they went and like chased down like a lion. Yeah, probably enough.
Right. In season and out of season strength training, how do you alter volume and load? Obviously, I think the three of us are very much proponents of strength training. It should be a year long, a year round part of training. But how do you manipulate different parameters in season?
Ooh, question. So generally with my philosophy around it is around the management of fatigue, and as an endurance athlete, you're already carrying a boatload of fatigue anyway, because you're doing whatever amount of volume it is, whether you're an 8-hour-a-week athlete or 10, 12, 20. So we don't want the gym to add any level of unnecessary stress that prevents you from then trying to perform and ultimately wearing support of that performance, not to hinder it. So volume in the gym is your killer, and I think we've kind of touched on that with the rep ranges in terms of like it is pointless doing a ton of volume. You're just going to create way too much fatigue. Whereas volume in your sport is clearly your friend. So what's enough is going to be, again, a little bit athlete dependent, training age, what they can expose to, what they can recover from. But you're generally going to manipulate how many sets they do overall, and you're going to manipulate how many reps they do. You may eliminate some exercises. So I would, so if I've got someone doing a session, say this week, like yesterday maybe would have been the last one, today would have been a real squeeze for maybe a Sunday race, I would eliminate any sort of eccentric work. So I wouldn't target any sort of real specific hamstring glute work like RDLs, deadlifts, etc. Because the eccentric forces are our most fatiguing, and more damage created to the muscles. So that might mean that if we're going to do any jump work with them, I would land them on a box rather than landing on the floor, because again, they're not accelerating into the ground and having to cope with those eccentric landing forces. And again, that's the reasons, like another sort of the reasons why we use certain exercises at certain times. You don't jump all the time, like and then it'd be like manipulate range of motion. So again, when we limit range of motion, and we can take the range of motion a lot smaller, we take the muscle through a lot less muscle lengthening. So again, we create less fatigue in that respect. And you just kind of just manipulating, like say, range of motion, volume, certain exercises, to kind of mitigate against what are the biggest causes of fatigue. And then managing that way. If they're not racing, again, like if they've got a week where they're not racing, you still need to be mindful of the amount of volume, but you might bring back in that kind of hamstring glute exercise, but you're still not doing a ton. Like rather than doing 3 sets of 5 that you would maybe, or 4 sets of 5 in the winter, you'd be doing like 2 sets of 5, 2 sets of 3, maybe some doubles if they're experienced enough to do doubles on a certain movement, so there's, you just vary the exercise, vary the range of motion. The loading parameter can change as well, potentially depending on the individual. So it's there's a few things there you can manipulate to help get them out. You can, if you're squatting or trap bar deadlifting as an example, you can increase the speed that they're moving at. So if you're using velocity-based training, you could be like, right, instead of us being down, moving between 0.5 to 0.6 and you're real heavy load and you're moving a lot slower, I'll put you between 0.7, 0.8, and you're going to be still, roughly 70% load rather than your 80% load, but you're moving faster. And again, a lot lighter weight, moving at faster speeds, create less fatigue as well. But it just teaches you some of the sort of adaptations that we're trying to get out of you to not be a slow endurance athlete all the time.
Yes.
Pretty
Kieran,
largely dependent on what the rest of your training or if it's in season, what the rest of your sort of competition schedule looks like. So like if you're racing every couple of weeks, then you're really looking to probably be maintaining strength quality sort of in season. I think Chris alluded to this earlier in terms of building strength versus maintaining strength looks very different in terms of if you're actually trying to get stronger. You're going to be having to push slightly more volume, and you kind of say maybe in an off-season context, you're going to be at the expense of maybe some of the other training you might be doing on the bike, because you have the ability to do that. Like you're not having sort of demands on you in terms of like not being fatigued going into a race. Whereas in season, obviously you don't want that. You don't want that fatigue going into the race. You want to be fresh and you want to be able to perform. So you want to be keeping kind of strength work to the minimum possible you can while still maintaining strength, which actually for most people is quite low. I mean, you can get away with doing kind of like quite a little amount in terms of in season and still maintaining your strength quite effectively. So that kind of idea of like strength training is a year-round thing. It doesn't mean that you have to be doing 2 or 3 strength training sessions every week all year round. You can work quite infrequently and still maintain what you've built through the winter or through your off season. And I think that, taking into account what you're doing, say if you're in the middle of your competitive season, you're just looking to kind of get the bare minimum. You say like maybe some of that faster work, which is going to kind of keep you feeling fresh, keep you ticking over in terms of, like I say, that's where that kind of some of that activation stuff does make sense in terms of, okay, now you're doing stuff that's a bit faster, a bit more kind of sort of high neuromuscular kind of demand on there, but infrequently. So you're just ticking over and keeping that stimulus there year round, versus say off season where you might be like, okay, now we can afford to have a little bit more fatigue going into your kind of like your long base rides and things like that, because it doesn't really matter as much to be a little bit fatigued doing that. And you can get away with then doing more volume because you're actually trying to push a strength quality in that time. So yeah, individual dependent, season dependent in terms of volume. And I think it's a different, probably a different conversation for someone who's doing 6 hours of bike training in a week versus someone who's doing 16 hours of bike training a week. You're doing 16, 20 hours. There's just not a lot of time there unless you're kind of, when you factor in sleeping, working potentially, or whatever else, there's just not enough time to add in more stress and the fatigue element of it, versus someone's doing 6 hours a week on the bike. Maybe they've got a long ride at the weekend, maybe they're recreational, maybe they are racing, but they're training on a kind of time budget. They've not got a lot of time there to dedicate to on bike training. It's like, well, maybe you can probably get away with doing a little bit more strength training, but then it's like, yeah, it's always kind of one or the other. You always have to be kind of cognizant of the fact that doing more of one thing means less of another. It's not kind of, you can't just keep layering on more and more. So yeah, if you're in your competitive season, you're already doing a load of work on the bike, then adding in more and more strength training is not necessarily going to be the answer in terms of fatigue management or performance.
Right, I'm going to fire through some questions that have been sent over. Right, discipline and variation. Are there any differences in strength training approaches for different cycling disciplines, gravel, road, mountain biking? Would you program differently for any of those?
The only one I would change anything for, if someone's specialty was a time trialing, because they don't need any power development really. Or we talk about power, like they just need maximal force expression and to be able to be constantly on the pedals. So anyone that's road racing, cross, gravel, gravel again a bit of a weird one, because they're just, some of these events are just always on the pedals, aren't they? There's no real explosivity to some of these events. Some events, someone might correct me there and actually shoot me down, but you know, from the athletes I work with, like road, cross, mountain bike XC, time trialists, and some of them have dabbled in gravel. Like there's not much I'd change. The only times I have changed it is if they did have pure time trialing focus. I didn't give them any jump work or anything else like that. The rest is like, how can I get them strong? How can I get them powerful?
Yeah.
What's the most appropriate exercise given their skill and experience? And then how do I manage that appropriately? But I don't think there is, like, because even if you're a climber and that's your specialty, depending on who you are, what you're doing, like, if you're a rider in the UK, as an example, and you're racing, you still need to be a bit of a jack of all trades. Like, you know, even if you're a breakaway specialist, you still need to be able to sprint at the end. Unless you're really at the sharp end of riding, like you haven't really got a specialty, or you're not going to be able to exploit your specialty just to be a climber and only have a mountain day, as an example. But even then, like, get them super strong, like more force through the pedals, you know, keep them as light as possible. And again, even if you're a lightweight climber, like the ability to accelerate on the climb still matters. The ability to get into the breakaway still matters. You might still, you know, this I'm thinking of a race concept, but even if you're a sportive rider doing these big, you know, haute routes or with like huge grand fondos, like you still need to be able to get out of the saddle and accelerate depending on the gradient that you have. And that, you know, is force expression, how quickly you can produce that force. So like what's, you know, yeah, not much on the grand scheme of things. I don't think that there needs to be.
Yeah.
Other
It's
than
more a question of degree versus kind, isn't it? Because you look at someone who's a track cyclist versus someone who's a Grand Tour rider. Like they still kind of need the same broad things. It just probably differs by the degree they need that. Obviously, the track cyclist needs to be a lot stronger than the endurance road cyclist, but they're still probably largely doing the same things, just to a different level. And then you look at mountain biking. I mean, you can maybe make the argument that upper body training is slightly more relevant in some contexts, just from
while we're on that, actually, Kieran, you can move nicely on to the next one. There's been several questions about upper body training for cyclists. So,
I mean, I think it's an interesting one, because endurance sport as a whole, not just cycling, like unless there's a specific, mostly running and cycling, like there's kind of a real thing of like, well, upper body training is not relevant because I don't use my upper body. And I'm like, well, that's just not true in any capacity. Like bike handling is one thing, but also just being robust, like the amount of road cyclists that have had like broken collarbones because they've fallen off the bike. And I'm like, maybe you wouldn't have broken it had you have been slightly stronger. Like, not to say that you won't. Obviously, hitting the road at 60k an hour is going to be pretty bad regardless of how much muscle you've got, but like there's always that aspect to it. But I mean, I think it's just upper body training is shied away from maybe on the kind of road side of things because of sort of historic ideas around like weight management, and it's just unnecessary because it's not directly propelling the bike in that context, I suppose. But then I think you move away from road cycling into any other discipline than cycling, and suddenly like the upper body becomes really integral to actually being able to ride effectively and handle the bike and all of those kind of things. So I think it's always going to be a relevant context. And I'm like, even cyclists spend some time off the bike occasionally, and just being a functional human being kind of relies on you to have at least some ability to use your arms. It's an interesting one where, like, yeah, maybe you don't need to be doing sort of like massively heavy bench pressing if you're a sort of like lightweight climber on the bike, but it's still relevant. It's still a relevant sort of like, your body can do that movement, so you probably should be training it in some capacity. And I just think it's interesting because you look at like downhill cycling, for example, and like the guys who are racing in the World Cup circuit, like across the whole field, like they all look completely different. You've got someone like Loic Bruni, who is incredibly strong, quite a big guy, racing against someone like Jackson Goldstone, who's tiny. And I'm like, he's clearly not going to be as strong, but it doesn't mean that he's not still strength training. So their strength training probably looks very similar. They're just doing it to a very different level. So you say, like, I think it doesn't differ that much. I think it just differs by how much they're going to emphasize certain qualities. But yeah, and from an upper body perspective, I think it's entirely relevant to any cyclist, because you still have to hold onto the bike. It's a contact point with the bike, is your arms and your hands. So I think it's something you should still be training in, because there's still going to be an element of power production that comes from your ability to manipulate and hold on to the bike.
Nice one. Right, it's the classic hill climbing season coming up, and the question: 3-minute power. What priorities do you see in maximizing 3-minute power in preparation for the hill climb season?
It's trained to specific demands of the event. Is the event a 3-minute climb? Like,
from an S&C perspective, I think he was alluding to. Do you feel he should change? Is there anything specific he should do from an S&C perspective, or are we still looking at general strength?
No, like, what's his limiter? What's his limiter of performance? Like,
yeah.
is he running out of gears? Like, can he not have a harder gear to go up the climbing? And if he can't, well, let's get you stronger.
Yeah.
And so, but then it's not just about like getting. It's like I say, it's not just about getting you stronger. It's how we express that force matters.
Yes, yeah.
So, like, get strong all you want, but if you're still moving slow, You can't accelerate and get on top of that gear.
Yeah.
So it's not what you lift, it's how you lift that matters. And if you lift in the right context, then what's known as your rate of force development, i.e. like how quickly you can produce that force. And for the rider, like how quickly can you get on top of that pedal rev and produce that power, that's relevant. And if you train in a proper way, even just focusing on maximal force production without anything else, your rate of force production will improve, which means then when you get to some of these hill climb events, irrespective of the gradient, and ultimately, I'll put it this way, cyclists need to produce power in a number of different ways. And depending on the terrain, the gradient, or whatever else, like, we have to be able to adapt to how we produce that power. If you are not strong enough when it really matters, you are going to slow down or stop. So, and eventually you're going to run out of gears. So there's nothing worse, as we've all experienced on a climb, and you start slamming that right shifter.
Yes.
Searching for more.
Okay.
Obviously on a silk climb, most of these guys are doing it on a single speed. So effectively you want to be able to, like, if you're whatever gear ratio you've got, okay, now, and you ran it on a gear ratio, whatever it was last year, can you increase the inch of gear for this year to go up? And if you can, you're stronger and you're more explosive. There's nothing there's nothing specific from a gym. Like, what are you capable of doing? How strong can we get you? Is that transferable to, like, how you're applying that force in the gym? Is that transferable to what you're doing on the bike? Because there's no point me saying I've just got you stronger.
Isn't it? Like 3 minutes is an interesting time domain, because it's kind of it's from a standpoint of pure power output, it's quite a long time frame. It's kind of probably more an argument of average power than it is of like true max power. So it's kind of like, say, like, if strength is the thing that is limiting you, then yeah, getting stronger is clearly going to be beneficial for that. But if it's a case of like, it's your ability to maintain an average over that, say you could, I don't know, you could stamp on the pedals hard initially and kind of have a huge peak in power, But if you can't maintain that for any length of time, then it's kind of like you might be really strong, but it's that strength is not the limiting factor there. So it's the individual thing. It's whatever limits you in that. So you getting stronger might be beneficial for that. But I think because of the time domain there, it's like it's not going to be your max power that's the limiting factor. But if you have a really low max power, say if you can't get on top of the fact that you just can't push fast enough at the right gear to maintain the power of that, then you kind of have to look at like, okay, maybe we're getting stronger and your ability to produce a high enough power, which then hopefully then if you raise the ceiling, allows you more room to bring up that kind of like I suppose threshold or whatever you want to call it. So basically you can produce a higher power, and then you can kind of try and bring yourself up to a point where you can maintain a greater percentage of that. If you can produce, I know it's a high number, but 2000 watts as a max power, then that just, it'll be nice. 2000 watts as a max power, that just means that anything below that is a lower relative percentage. And obviously if you're trying to do something over 3 minutes where average power is the kind of, that's the thing you're going for in that respect, like if you can then have a higher potential, you can bring your average power higher up to that, which obviously if you have a really low ceiling, you might be working at 95% of that ceiling. But if that ceiling's always there, you can never kind of push beyond that. And that's where it's like, okay, maybe strength is your limiting factor, maybe power output is your limiting factor, in which case then, yeah, getting stronger is probably going to be really beneficial. But if it's just the fact that you're just not fit enough, so you can't, your thresholds are not high enough to maintain a high enough average power, then it's not the strength that's necessarily the limiting factor. So yeah, it's going to be very dependent on the individual and what is stopping them from achieving a faster time or a lower power up.
Right, well, nearly there, guys. Something I've spoken to you about before, Chris. Core training. It gets a huge amount of coverage in the on social media. That these must-do core routines to make you a quicker cyclist. Where do you stand on it? Do you program specific core work? Go for it.
Not as much as what is traditionally given and prescribed, I guess. Again, like we've always kind of said, or not everyone, I suppose, but like your core isn't as weak as what people try to make out, and it's not the real limiting factor of your performance on a bike, and it's not going to actually really do much to improve your performance either. And then where we are now, 2025. So early last year, Sitko and et al. Actually came out with a study to prove the point that we all thought we were all beating the drum was saying was true. Strength training versus core training versus no training. Strength training had the biggest result in terms of accelerating performance. Core training had a minimal contribution. Obviously, if you don't do any, they're both, there was zero effect on terms of improving performance. So it's not to say, and again, you've got to be careful with it, because it's like if someone really enjoys doing loads of core work and gets from something out from it, like I'm not going to say you're an idiot for doing so, don't do it. Like if you like same as stretching and all the other bits and things that you can come with it, it's like you're spending all this time over to the right doing all this stuff, but you're never in the gym. Let's just minimize some of this delivery to whatever else you're doing, the core and the mobility and everything else. Yes, there is a level of importance to it, but let's get you over to the left doing some gym work, because we know this physically improves performance.
Yeah.
You have to look after your body over here a little bit, but don't stop wasting hours and multiple minutes and hours every single week on something that's having very little effect on your performance. Like, how as coaches can we get you improving performance, also managing your body? And I think it's just trying to shift that priority across to say, look, it's not terrible, it's not bad for you, but it's probably just not giving you the performance benefits you've been told it will.
I think I only ever really have it more in a case of not necessarily from a performance improvement standpoint, but more of like that resilience. It's just movement variability. So I think putting it in not so much as like doing core training is going to improve your performance. It's more like doing any kind of endurance sport. By nature, you are repeating things over and over and over, and especially something like road cycling, where I'm like, you're kind of in a fairly fixed position. You're kind of just doing the same movement patterns for hours and hours on end. There's very little movement variability in that. And obviously what we're doing in the gym is more movement variability, but I'm like, And cycling, you never really laterally flex, for example. You never kind of, there's no huge amount of rotation in there. So I'm like throwing some of that stuff in terms of core training, and not the kind of core training that's like the circuit style of just doing 1,000,001 crunches. I'm not sure that really adds much in terms of value. As I said, like I think you get more in terms of performance benefit from just more gym style training. But I think having movement variability is in throwing in rotation, throwing in lateral flexion, throwing in movements that you just don't get on the bike. I think there's benefit in terms of bringing in enough movement variability to kind of maintain a body that is able to move outside of the fixed movement patterns you introduce with your endurance sport. And I think it's just there's an element there of just keeping someone healthy enough and able to do those movements, even if that doesn't necessarily directly transfer to performance on the bike.
It makes a lot of sense.
You've got to understand as well, like people are doing, like, say, as example, plank routines. But you're not on a bike just sat still doing a Superman. Like, you are bracing a body and producing force at the same time. Like, and that isn't replicated. Like, we can get more from your core in certain exercises that we prescribe. So we're going to get you stronger, and also your trunk and your core is having to brace to enable you to produce and resist force. And again, it's just sort of like a different education standpoint of like, we have a smarter way of strengthening your core, and it's via something else.
Yeah.
I don't need to give you X and Y because I've, from top to bottom of this training plan, your core has had a huge demand in having to brace and resist forces. So it's, but again, it's like speaking to that, because even now, like, people will ask me, I think I need more core, I need this, and I'll just go, why do you think that? And then try and help explain, like, okay, well, no, well, actually, probably not that. It is maybe this. Let's work on X or Y, just to help, because again, it's the core, like the glutes, is like the scapegoat of performance in endurance sports. If you're riding, if you've had a bad ride, or my glutes are weak, not producing power, or look like a piece of spaghetti on a bike, it's like, oh, it's my core. I'm like, no, that's, it's just a ton of fatigue eventually crept in, and everyone has a body that's going to break down at some point if you've gone beyond your means. So
yeah. Right, guys, just to finish off, just give me your key takeaway points for strength training for endurance athletes. We'll start with you, Kieran.
I think going heavy is probably a good one. I think too many people view strength training as another way to just implement more strength endurance work, which you already get enough of from your training on the bike. So I think it's the best time to do things that you don't get from your sport, in terms of true power and strength development, in terms of getting the adaptive benefits of that. So you're not doing it to chase movements. You're not doing it to chase things you get on the bike. You're doing it to chase things you don't get. And that comes down to just lifting heavier loads, putting yourself under some kind of actual level of resistance that is beyond that which you get in your sport, and then using it as an opportunity to develop things like strength, power, rate of force development, all of which then have both an indirect and direct transfer to your time on the bike. So I think it's doing it properly, effectively, not kind of just mimicking what you get in sport already. It's taking it as an opportunity to build yourself physical qualities outside of what you get from your sport.
Nice one. Thank you, Chris.
I think it's just understanding, as an endurance athlete, one of your biggest enemies is fatigue. And the more fatigue that comes into the system, the more your ability to produce and resist force becomes compromised. And the way to mitigate against that is being stronger, which means because you'll fatigue a lot later and you'll be able to produce a lot more force for longer. So you'll go faster for longer without breaking down. So fundamentally, find a way of starting. It doesn't matter how, doesn't matter if it's in your home or if you've got access to a local gym. Just start and find out what will show up for you in terms of what performance benefits you'll get. Yeah, and just remember that we're trying to develop the qualities your sport doesn't give you. So, but yeah, there's
perfect.
I could go on, but I'm not. I won't.
Nice one. Well, look, guys, thank you so much for your time. It's really appreciated. I'll get this edited. I'll get some shorts done, and I'll get them sent across to you, and then use them as you wish on socials.
Perfect.
Nice
Cheers.
one.
Nice to meet you guys. It was really interesting.
Take it easy.
All the best.
Bye bye.
See you guys. Bye.